South Carolina went even further, issuing an exposition and protest which put forth the doctrine of nullification. They argue that the Constitution was simply a contract between the sovereign states, and that the states retained the ultimate right to judge the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress. If the states found these laws to be unconstitutional, they could simply nullify them and refuse to enforce them. The radical implication of this doctrine was clear. If it were accepted, it would dramatically undermine the authority of the federal government and potentially lead to the breakup of the United States. While Jackson agreed that the tariffs were too high, he pointedly rejected the doctrine of nullification. In 1832, the crisis reached a peak when the South Carolina legislature officially declared the national tariffs of 1828 and 1832 as unconstitutional and forbade any further collection of these taxes. However, South Carolina found itself standing alone. No other state supported this radical challenge to the government's ability to regulate trade. In President Jackson's annual message to Congress in 1832, even as he asked Congress to lower the tariffs, he repeated that he would use the powers of the presidency to enforce the federal law. In 40 days, he warned, I can have within the limits of South Carolina 50,000 men. The South Carolina nullifiers responded by mobilizing the state militia, at which Jackson requested from Congress a force bill authorizing him to use the army against them. The crisis was only averted by the diligent work of Henry Clay, a key national leader of the Whig Party who had previously helped craft the Missouri Compromise. He introduced a plan to gradually reduce the tariff schedule. On the same day, March 1, 1833, both this compromise bill and the force bill passed Congress, and Jackson signed both. Clay's plan enabled South Carolina to back down gracefully, though it was not as much as they had wanted. They rescinded their nullification ordinance, although in a final gesture of defiance, they issued another law, nullifying the force bill. What was the significance of Jackson's presidency? His administration had a profound effect on shaping the evolving political system of the country. In many ways, he strengthened the presidency and gave it a new vigor and authority. He cast himself as the only government official elected by the entire nation, and thus intrinsically more able to represent the interests of the entire nation. He wielded the veto energetically, helping to make the president a key player in determining policy. And because of his controversial actions, Jackson had also helped accelerate the formation of a new party system and establish the idea of political parties as a legitimate and necessary part of the American political system. The party that solidified around Jackson called themselves the Democrats. In general, they followed Jefferson in favoring limited national government, states' rights, and free trade. They argued that individuals could succeed in American society without significant aid from the government. They suggested that the expansion of government power reflected the will of a dangerous aristocratic minority that was attempting to corrupt the republic for their own selfish aims. Demographically, most Democrats were Protestant and native-born, but the party also appealed to many immigrants, particularly Catholics. Generally speaking, the Democrats were more laissez-faire in their attitude towards social and moral reform. They were much less likely to embrace efforts to actively reform society, such as through temperance or the abolition of slavery. From Jackson's opponents and those who espoused Hamiltonian ideas about government came another party called the Whigs. This party generally supported the idea of a powerful national government as a necessary adjunct to a strong economy. One of the principal intellectual leaders of the Whigs, Henry Clay, put forth this idea in what became known as the American system. This plan called for a national bank to stabilize the currency, high protective tariffs to encourage domestic manufacturing, and internal improvements, that is, transportation projects, to encourage the growth of a market-oriented economy. The Whigs also emphasized their opposition to Jackson's ideas about the power of the presidency, suggesting that Congress was a true representative of the people's interests. Indeed, their very name came from the English Whig Party, which had traditionally been opposed to arbitrary monarchical powers. The Whigs were also much more likely to be of English ancestry and were far more inclined to be Presbyterians, Baptists, and Congregationalists, the bunch who were active in the revival and reform movements such as abolitionism and temperance. Whigs themselves argued that they were the party of the common man, suggesting that government did have to take an active role in society to provide the conditions that allowed ordinary people to rise and succeed. The most important difference between the people who supported the Whigs and those who supported the Democrats was economic. Whigs were strongest in areas where people depended upon market relations, where people were eager to have government support for a stable currency, strong government encouragement for commercial development through transportation, and tariffs to nurture domestic manufacturing. Keep in mind, the people who supported these policies were not just wealthy factory owners or merchants. Many factory laborers or groups like ordinary workers engaged in commerce and transportation wanted government support to help expand their economic opportunities. For instance, people who were paid cash wages certainly wanted a stable currency. Likewise, many workers saw publicly sponsored education as a key way that their children would gain greater opportunity in an economic climate that increasingly valued literacy. Democrats, on the other hand, were more likely to find support among those who were less interested in market relations, in particular subsistence farmers. Growing their own food and manufacturing most of their own goods, they saw little need for government assistance. Both parties portrayed themselves as representing ordinary people. During this era, the entire imagery of politics changed. People like Washington, Madison, Monroe were unabashed elites, but the men who followed Jackson more typically tried to portray themselves as ordinary folk. In the election of 1840, for instance, the Whigs ran William Henry Harrison of Indiana. He was famous for leading the army that crushed the Indian rebellion of Tecumseh in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. His partisans used this to recast him as a second Andrew Jackson, as a military hero, someone who had been born on the frontier in a log cabin sipping hard cider, an ordinary man who had risen to prominence through his own efforts. It was a complete hogwash. Harrison was from a wealthy Virginia plantation family, but the tactics worked, and the Whigs enjoyed their first presidential victory. The rise of the second-party system heralded some key changes in American politics. Some of the underlying philosophical arguments about government remained the same, but the political system had become considerably more democratic. Both the Whigs and the Democrats embraced mass participation politics. In the past, for instance, candidates for office had been hand-picked by the party elites. In 1832, a small third party, the Anti-Masonic Party, invited their membership to nominating conventions where they could directly participate in choosing candidates for public office. This more democratic method of selecting candidates was quickly embraced by both of the major parties. Both parties also began to publish a clear party platform that articulated what policies they supported. Backed by increasingly sophisticated party organizations, the era of highly organized partisan politics had begun.